If I may begin personally, my story begins with an invitation from a Catholic aid agency to smuggle books into Czechoslovakia. And I was told that the agency had borrowed a drug smuggler's car, which had been particularly adapted to smuggle a great deal of cocaine behind the Iron Curtain that could be now used for smuggling books. And the reason that books were needed was because in Czechoslovakia, the communist authorities had decided the best way to combat the Catholic Church was simply to make ordinations illegal. And they said, well, in one generation there'll be no more priests. No more priests, no more mass, no more church. So all we need to do is to make sure that there are no ordinations. And then rather, in a way not dissimilar from China, which is a completely different subject, but you'll be aware that we're talking about the same thing, an underground Catholic church emerged in which there was a determination to ordain priests, but they had to be trained. And there was no access to books. So they needed some idealistic and slightly naive young men from the West who were willing to smuggle, and I was one of them. And I met some very brave and noble and holy people in Czechoslovakia, and I did something similar in Russia. I was a bad smuggler. I kept on getting caught. But I found that I escaped most of the consequences of being caught quite wonderfully. I was left, however, after a number of visits to both Prague and Moscow and St. Petersburg, as it has become, with a sense of the taste of totalitarian society. I grew up as a teenager, and two of the biggest influences on me were reading Dostoevsky and Solzhenitsyn. Solzhenitsyn is not very well known anymore, but he was enormously important because he documented what was really happening behind the Iron Curtain. And there was fake news in the 1970s just as much as there is today, and large portions of the press were given over to trying to persuade the West that communism worked very fairly and very happily behind the Iron Curtain, despite the fact that anybody who knew anything was trying to get out of it, and nobody ever tried to get into it. Something rather strange happened to me in about somewhere near the end of 1999. You remember when the wall came down in 1989, there was enormous excitement. An academic even wrote a book called The End of History. I mean, he meant it in a particular Hegelian sense. No longer would there be capitalism and communism, a free society and the proletariat fighting against each other for a new synthesis. I think his name was Fukuyama, I think. But he made a category error of the most enormous proportions. But nonetheless, like a lot of people, I was thrilled at the death of communism, as it seemed to be, because I knew the death toll in Russia was mind-boggling, and twice as bad in China under Mao Zedong, and communism as a particular form of 20th century utopianism had caused damage that was almost impossible to conceive. And it's always been very strange that such a ruthless and dangerous ideology captivates the minds of the young as much 40 or 50 years ago then as it still does today in a new form. Somewhere about 1998, the year 2000, I got a sense that the thing I had come to know behind the Iron Curtain was back. And it was almost like a taste. I can't explain it. It was an intuition, a taste, a smell, and I thought, I know this thing. How is it back? In what sense? And I began to do some reading, and there are people who are far more philosophically and politically educated than I am, and it took me a while to catch up. But I began to read about the Frankfurt School, just about the time as post-modernity began to hit the universities, particularly the university I was teaching in. And as we try to understand this move from modernity to whatever post-modernity was, and try to conceive of whatever might follow that in terms of intellectual and philosophical fashion, I found myself being introduced to the Frankfurt School. There may be many people who are experts here, but to put it in its briefest sense, there were a group of idealists and utopians who asked themselves if Marx had really got it right. They wondered if he might not have made two errors in his thinking. First of all, he wasn't a very good economist, and there was the fear in the 1930s that his economic panaceas might not work. And they also wondered if he had it right, that the main lens through which to see a Hegelian conflict really was the proletariat and the capitalist lens. What if the proletariat didn't rise up everywhere and produce the kind of solution that he foresaw? Then the utopian experiment that bore his name would collapse because it had been predicated on the wrong instrumentalization, perhaps. So, and again, it's very difficult to know if this was coordinated or spontaneous or something that simply emerged with a degree of intellectual kinetic energy. Who knows? But the Frankfurt School were a group of people who began to say, let us imagine our utopian society, but based not on the resolution of a conflict between the capital and the worker, but instead between an assault on culture, a complete reconfiguration of the culture of the Judeo-Christian tradition. And it begins, of course, with the family and with the role of women. And its particular lens is one of power. When we talked about Adler, and I briefly suggested that actually Adler's analysis finds its real home in communism and Marxism, because it understands human beings in terms of power relations, and in particular in terms of their identity with groups. It is the opposite to Christianity. Christianity has given us this anthropology, which is now much misunderstood. Upon Christian anthropology is based the sacredness of the human being. It's one thing to admire a particular Jainists who have a broom before them so they don't unconsciously crush any insects underneath them. But it's another thing to recognize that Christianity has brought a sense of the sacred to every single human being's life, so that those who would oppress and enslave, diminish, crush human beings are rebuked, because humanity, each human being is seen to be someone consciously made in the image of God. But Marxism contradicts this, which is one of the reasons why you can waste so many people in your political experiments. And cultural Marxism, as we've come to call it, its proponents tell us we mustn't even call it that. The point about it is, once you've named something, you begin to understand its character. So they'd like us to stop us naming it. And you'll find, as you look around the internet, a number of people saying, no, this is a far-right fascist conspiracy to call it cultural Marxism. Don't even think about it. Such a thing doesn't exist. And indeed, I've been rebuked on a number of occasions saying, you are intellectually negligent if you think that you can call this movement Marxism. Marxism is based purely in the terms that Karl Marx designed it, and how dare you take the categories that Marx used and impose it on the Frankfurt School and continue to call it Marxism. There's no economics in this at all. And in one sense, that's right. But one of the reasons why we call it that is because Marx's main vision, which was a reconfiguration of power from those who had it to those who don't have it, in order to produce a utopian society of equality, is the same vision. It's just that a different route is taken to achieve it. And you'll already be aware that there are enormous problems with the concepts that we're dealing with. Equality works very well when you're dealing with numbers. It works much more problematically when you're dealing with values. And if you were to say, for example, that Mozart is equally gifted as Beethoven, one would never arrive at a solution, because you simply can't use equality to compare the two. And yet, but equality has been used as a means of measuring the instrumentation of power relations. And what we saw in the 1960s and the 1970s, as the Frankfurt School began to spread its ideology, looked like something really quite reasonable and even perhaps welcome. Human beings have a natural longing for justice. That is part of what it is to be made in the image of God. But it is one thing to deal with injustice when you see it, which is what the Bible tells us to do. And it's another thing to create justice, because to create justice would require a reconfiguration of human nature. If we accept the basic theological proposition that we're made in the image of God, but that we are flawed, we are never going to be able to create justice, because human beings will always be engaged in struggles with our fallen, egocentric nature, what Christians call sinfulness. And you can only create the just society by changing human nature. But if you believe there is nothing essentially wrong with human beings, if you believe in the perfectibility of humans, that all you need to do is to find the right education program or the right political structure, then if you ignore what the Bible tells us about humanity, then you might want to try and give it a go. And utopianism, I've always seen it as something birthed by the Judeo-Christian tradition, but wanting, if you like, the fruits without being willing to accept the terms and conditions. So the leaders of utopian movements over the last 300 years, certainly since the French Revolution and beyond, like very much what the prophets tell us the kingdom of God looks like. It looks like people with their tears wiped away. It looks like the lion and the lamb lying down together. It looks like the harmonious restoration of relationships, and in particular between men and women. But you have to wait for heaven for it, says the Christian tradition. And so we have a group of I guess I'd call it heretics, utopian heretics, who want the goal, but are not willing to go to God to get it, and believe it can be done in human terms. They're a political version of the building of the Tower of Babel. Let's do this on our own terms. And so cultural Marxism starts off by saying, we would like to create an even playing field between men and women. And so early feminism looked very attractive because as industrialization changed the burden in the domestic household, and also as capitalism began to soak up women as well as men, the way in which families grew and family life was maintained began to shift under the pressure of technology and capitalism. And the difficulty was how could human beings continue to breed and have families and have communities in which the family was a central part of the glue, and yet respond to the challenges that both capitalism and industrialization faced the family with. And feminism, as the first stage of cultural Marxism, said, well, let's put power relations first and leave the children to look after themselves. And so that's been, if you like, the history of the last 60 years. The attempt has been to give equality of opportunity to women, which is a wonderful thing in principle, for anyone who doesn't like injustice. Well, there we are, the centrality of the child, which is really what I'm talking about. And here we have a... Hello, thank you for coming in just at that moment. That's extremely helpful. Because it was the children who have been the price that's been paid for this experiment. Mothers have found it difficult to be both mothers and to hold family together, and at the same time to take a full and proportionately equal place in the workplace. So we began to deal with the tensions of this very badly, and in fact, Camille Paglia, who's a wonderful lesbian feminist I greatly admire, she has an integrity of clarity of thought that is inspirational, despite the fact you might think that I wouldn't like a lesbian feminist. I do. I think as an intellectual she's very good. And one of the things she said recently is that feminism has completely failed mothers. It didn't even give a thought to motherhood, or to the fact that being a mother is something so embedded into the biological nature of femininity that any feminist movement ought at some point to give thought to being a mother. And finally, 60 years or later, after the birth of feminism, she has rebuked the movement for missing the obvious. Now, if any of us had rebuked feminism with this, we would have been dismissed as patriarchal dinosaurs, incapable of exercising a proper opinion. So I'm very glad that she's finally said it, but she's said it 50 years too late and too quietly. The interesting thing was what would come after feminism. It was impossible not to be a feminist in the early days, because after all, first wave feminism was about women having the vote. How can one possibly be against that? And then second wave feminism was about making sure there was an equal, a level playing field in the capitalist society. Well, why should there not be? And particularly if a woman decides she wants to have a career in industry or at work and put having a family second or not have, of course she should be free to do that. Why should she not? But feminism didn't stop there. The notion of power relations and the reconfiguration of culture had some more tricks up its sleeve. And third wave feminism, which was not foreseen by many until it happened, came with a very interesting idea that, if you like, is at the root of many of our troubles. Third wave feminism said that reality was essentially what you thought it was in your head. And so whether you were a man or a woman was something that was conceived in your own head. And this was combined with a period when subjectivity became the template by which we judged everything. And in England, under the equality laws, we had a dreadful moment when the criminal law was changed so that the definition of a law moved from being what 12 reasonable people on a bus would think it would be to being whatever a person who thought themselves a victim thought it was. This is such an epistemological shift that has the greatest implications for how you assess reality, for how you assess relations, and it moves from everything from criminal law to rape, of course, particularly if you can change your mind retrospectively. And one of the implications in feminism, which was based on a fairly primitive notion of equality, not worked out, not articulated, not tested, immediately spilt over into the business of homosexual relationships. One of my greatest concerns as gay marriage emerged was not to want to lecture society on people's orientation. I mean, as Christians, we may have a number of views on the spiritual and psychological implications of such things, and it's a complex and multivariate area. But to change the nature of marriage so that children could be bought from surrogate parents, and thereby depriving children of one of the most basic of all human rights, which is to have access to your biological parents. To do that as a form of experimentation, to give therapeutic validation to a couple who couldn't find it any other way but by trading children, seemed to me to be a complete betrayal of Western civilization. But nobody seemed to mind, because it was done on the basis of equality again. But it was equality of the homosexual couple, not of the child who was conceived. Can I take questions afterwards?
Yes.
Thank you. Please keep it, though, and have it at the end. And so the problem one of the great problems with gay marriage had to do with the rights of children being placed at the bottom of the hierarchy rather than nearer the top. And then out of third wave feminism came the whole trans movement. The difficulty with the trans movement is that what it has done is has taken a mental illness and turned it into a political cause. And it's also moved it from something that applies to a very sad 0.01% of society to an exponentially greater number as children and teenagers have sought to find a solution to existential discomfort. And we're finding a number of responses to the ideological agenda that's been placed. In America, there is a class action from some surrogate children saying we've been brought up in same-sex marriage households which have had a particular ethical culture to them, which we have found deeply disturbing. And nobody ever asked us. So we are asking for some form of legal redress, because this was an abuse of our human rights. And human rights are a problematic area, because human rights are essentially a form of social contract, so that between different parts of society. They used to be, under the Judeo-Christian metaphysic, endowed by God because we had value as creatures, and this value then cascaded between people. But the notion of human rights changed in the last 50 years and became simply a matter of what society in lateral rather than vertical terms decides to build into its agreements with each other. So we found that cultural Marxism was a developing movement, beginning with first wave feminism, second and third wave, spilling over into gay marriage as a particular notion of equality was pursued, with implications for children, spilling over into post-modernity and the notion that the truth was something that was subjectively interpreted, and there was no objective criteria by which to judge it, which does mean that if you have a truth in your own head, nobody outside your own head is entitled to tell you that you're mistaken, which lies, of course, at the root of the validation of turning gender dysphoria into a medical and political program. The danger with the next stage in the cultural Marxist development is that it will involve paedophilia. And the reason for that is that once you bought the argument that you were born gay, for which there is no scientific evidence, how one becomes gay is an immensely complex physiological, psychological, cultural, existential question that is very different amongst men to women, and it's complicated by bisexuals in the middle, for whom different rules entirely apply. But one thing we do know, we know you're not born that way, and we know that there are a whole series of subcultures with different variables. But once you accept the Freudian notion that, first of all, the most important thing about us is our sex drive and our sexual identity, and then you say, I can make up reality as I go along, and we want to impose equality, very soon you find a person who says, usually a man, who says, actually, I was born being sexually attracted to children. And where are you going to divide the line? 14, 15, 13, 12, 11, 9, 10. And if it makes people happy, which is the criteria for authenticity in our society, I'm born this way, I'm a victim, don't you victimize me even further by telling me that my desires are illegitimate. And this brings erotic and romantic happiness. So at the moment in England, we have the example of teachers teaching 6- and 7-year-olds to write love letters from the prince no longer to the princess, but to a male servant he's in love with. There's an exercise of erotic and romantic imagination. You can only bring this agenda to children if you sexualize them. Because for children, love is asexual. Puberty changes everything, but before puberty, it's asexual, and what we've begun to do is to sexualize our children, and that's the route to legitimizing paedophilia. So what we've discovered is that an ideological movement that begins with equality turns the relationship between men and women into one of antagonism, reduces women to a monodimensional role in an industrial and economic society, produces forms of relationship in which children pay a really quite serious price, will soon move towards both polygamy and polyamory, because there's no reason why you should restrict these experiments in romantic and erotic attraction to two people. Why would you? At the moment we do it sequentially, but why not do it all at the same time? And indeed there are a number of political exponents of the progressive values which are arguing exactly for that. And theologically, we have a number of really quite serious problems. We have the problem that feminism is predicated on an antagonism between men and women. And one of the things that few people have talked about is that the shift in power relations between men and women has involved a response to what feminists have seen as misogyny. men hating women. Well, if men hate women, we will hate them back, is the only proper response. And particularly if we're dealing with power relations, then the greatest abuser of power is clearly the father figure. And so father figures, or the abuse of power by the patriarchy, becomes a motif. I was involved in a television interview on the BBC with a woman priest. We were discussing the ordination of women to the episcopate, and the intellectually and cogent and sophisticated interviewer turned to me and said, "How can you possibly be a supporter of the patriarchy?" And of course the problem with the question is it presumes a certain frame of reference and an answer. And so I said, well, as a Christian Anglican bishop as I was then, I don't like the patriarchy. You've described something which is which interprets people by their power relations. I believe in paternal intimacy, and that what we're offered by God the Father in our spirituality is a degree of reconciled paternal intimacy. And this is love versus power. And this, of course, is the great controlling paradigm in the two narratives that we have. The political paradigm is all about power. And Christianity is unique in that it talks about love. But our problem is, certainly in English, that we have a very reduced vocabulary. It's a paradox, or rather it's a surprise that in English, where we have a very wide vocabulary, which Shakespeare uses to its fullest to show the glories of the intricacy of linguistic association, that one of the most powerful emotions in human language that has about 12 variants we use just one word for, utterly unable, unlike the Greeks, to distinguish between different forms of love. And I think probably Christians should stop using the word love in English and instead talk about holy compassion. It seems to me that what the Bible most means by love is most easily encapsulated by the phrase holy compassion, and it removes it from the erotic and the romantic, which is a subset of its own, which ought not to be the controlling ideological view for it. So we find ourselves as Christians with power relations between men and women being almost professionalized socially. With hierarchy, which we find that the Bible gives us a notion of inverted hierarchy, where the top of the hierarchy is not power but love and compassion. We find ourselves with why is Mary appearing so much in the 20th century? Well, one theological answer to that is she's the antidote to feminism. She heals the rebellion and the antagonism of an independence of Eve, not to become subjugated, but to become the most powerful figure you could imagine. What greater potency could there be to be the gateway for the incarnate Word who comes to heal and to save? If you shift power to potency, Mary is potent, like no other woman. Mary legitimizes the extraordinarily privilege of co-creation that women have and men don't have. Mary's obedience and her humility are not aspects of subjugation, they are responses to love. So the Christian view of humanity, which involves inverted hierarchies, that involve dynamics of humility and love and self-giving, are trashed and repudiated by this enormously muscular movement that reduces all relationships to power. And the real problem we face as a church is that instead of seeing this negation of revelation and the graces and the gifts that human beings are given in order to find out who we truly are under God, the church has adopted and borrowed and lived off the progressive agenda, and even sought, and still starts to seek, to try and reconfigure the tradition in order to make space for this progressive, anti-Christian, anti-love, anti-revelation movement, which is a form of enormously dangerous utopianism that has achieved nothing. I mean, if you ask what progressive politics and egalitarian has achieved and where it has achieved it, all the defenders of communism and either 1.0 or 2.0 say, well, the conditions aren't right yet. They've never been right. And the casualty level is enormous. So one of the great challenges the church faces at the moment is to find, having had generations constantly bombarded with secular brainwashing through the education and through the media, is to develop a confidence in our own categories that come through revelation, not through political imagination. But the church appears to have lost its nerve. And the great virtue of the traditional part of the church is that we say we will not lose our nerve. We refuse to swallow this aberration. Apart from anything else, we're theologically literate enough to see that it is the antithesis of Christianity, and we're historically and culturally literate enough to see that it has done nothing but cause damage between people, the disintegration of society, the destruction of familial relationships, the perversion of categories of love and kindness that Christianity embodies. The difficulty is that if there is a spiritual element to this, and there may very well be, it appears to be a spiritual element in which the progressive culture hates Christianity. Because the one thing you can no longer do, and this has emerged with enormous speed in the last 5 years, you can no longer stand up in the public space and say, I believe in marriage between a man and a woman. I believe in, let's call it biological rather than political marriage. Let us call the other thing political. It's a polite word. But let us talk about biological marriage. If you stand up and say, I believe in biological marriage because it has a number of virtuous characteristics, you're now unemployable because you're in breach of equalities policy. Because equalities policy has begun to take language and to change it so that it means entirely different things. Inclusivity means including everything except the Judeo-Christian tradition. Everything except the Judeo-Christian revelation. It is a form of embedded political and sociological lie. But we have been so slow to challenge it, so slow to stand up and to say, I don't go along with this, that we have already lost the legal battle. So what is the church going to do? Because in Europe in particular, we are now silenced by law. Freedom of speech is past. You cannot say these things in the public space and not be deemed guilty of a crime. And one of the tricks, of course, that has been used to abuse therapeutic notions and to take the word phobia, which was always problematic anyway, and to tack it on to any kind of ideology. And then you get the hate crimes that we have. It seems almost certain in terms of the public sector throughout most of the Western world that you can no longer hold Christian views against this progressive, inclusive, politicized view and be employed. So you have to hide them. Well, we can just about manage that. But nor can you stand on street corners anymore and invite people to repent. Repent of what, they would say? Repent of our sexual longings? And if you say yes, because actually that applies to whoever you are, with whatever longings you have, then they call for the police and you're arrested. So the ways in which we get to evangelize are restricted. The way in which we get to do church are restricted. A number of preachers have had their sermons sent to the police and have received visits from the police saying you are causing a hate crime in your pulpit. So for the next 5 years, it's only going to get worse, and it's going to make it extremely difficult. And perhaps one of the answers may be to go back to the catacombs. It may be that what we'll need to do is to have a public discourse, a public conversation using the simplest of Christian categories. God loves you, you can be forgiven. Don't tell them what they can be forgiven of, or that become a hate crime, but nonetheless, God loves you and you can be forgiven. And then in private, we teach about sexuality and human identity and relations, because you may have to do that in private. But if that wasn't difficult enough, if this Christian church had not been debilitated enough by the restriction of free speech, the ejection from the public sphere, we face Islam. The difficulty with Islam is that there are two versions of Islam, as I'm sure you probably know. There is the period when Muhammad was in Mecca and the period when he was in Medina. And when he was in Mecca, he was very well disposed to Jews and Christians. Actually, he needed them to get on. And the beginning of the Quran, though the Quran is not exactly chronological, but partly, you will find bits of the Quran which are really quite benign. And the most benign bit is actually stolen from Jewish spirituality, which people often quote as to show how wonderful the Quran is in terms of its, extinguish one life and you kill a universe. This wasn't Muhammad. This is actually a piece of Jewish theology. But when Muhammad went to Medina and began his piratical career, the Quran changes nature in terms of language and scope and theology. And the problem that we have is the Quranic notion of abrogation. And as I expect you probably already know, that means that if you have the Quran, the second part of the Quran, anything towards the end of the Quran takes precedence over the beginning. And all the most violent passages involving retribution are found at the end. And that's one of the reasons why, again, this is not talked about, why in the public space you never get a moderate imam holding a radical imam to account. Why is that? If the Quran is as benign as it is malign, why is there no public debate about the way in which these texts take precedence? And the answer is that in terms of the idea of abrogation means that that what is called radical Islam by the press, which is nonsense in terms of words, one might call it activist Islam, takes precedence over Irenic Islam. The difficulty we have is that progressive politics has got a hierarchical list of those who are victims and those who are in power. And partly under the shadow of colonial expansion and Western domination, Islam has been given a victim status by progressive culture. So those who are framing our laws and reframing them, in particularly in European society, have decided that Islam can do no wrong. And when Islam does do wrong, the categories of language are changed. So you never hear on the media talk of Islamic terrorists, only terrorists. And the part of the problem with this is, again, we can't stand up in the public space and debate with Islam because of the notion of hate crime and the accusation of Islamophobia, which is on the verge of being carried into a number of legal jurisprudential arenas. In England, part of my job used to be to engage in interfaith symposiums, and one day, it was in about 2002, I was holding a very prestigious symposium at my university that I was chairing, and the Islamic speaker said to me, "Gavin, can we stop early? I'd like to get off campus before the traffic jams." I said, "Well, but you're the last speaker, we won't hear you." "It doesn't matter," he said. Let's call it a day. It doesn't matter if I speak." I said, "Well, no, it really matters. People want to hear you. You're a very eminent Islamic theologian. They've come for a long way. They've heard of Brian." "Well," he said, "it's actually, my dear friend, I'm only here because you asked me. We're friends. I've been doing this now for 35 years since I came to this country. I'm a bit tired." Anyway, he said, "As far as I'm concerned," he said, "frankly, the battle is won." I said, "What do you mean the battle is won?" He said, "Well, Great Britain will be an Islamic republic in the time of my grandchildren." I said, "You're joking. I mean, what kind of conversation is this?" "No," he said, "no, actually, possibly in time of my children." I said, "Well, what are you talking about?" He said, the 7 largest industrial conurbations in England already in 2002, the majority of people under 16 are Muslim. He said, "You're very kindly offering us mayors for cities." We've changed our minds, but we did at the time. And he said, "So in a number of large cities, we are the democratic majority. Put demography and democracy together, and we will have cities that vote for Sharia law. And it will happen really quite soon. And no one will stop us." And indeed, at that very period, the Archbishop of Canterbury was giving a lecture to judges saying that it was about time that Sharia law was properly recognised in the English jurisprudential tradition. And when you go away and you look, you see that indeed in 2032, the proportion of Muslims in Great Britain will be between 12 and 15%. If we were to be alarmist and apocalyptic for a moment, Hitler was able to subvert the democratic tradition in Germany with 10 to 12% of the population who were Nazis. It represents something of a tipping point in terms of voting numbers. And anyway, if you think that's too apocalyptic and alarmist, then wait until 250, when everyone agrees that the more than 50% of the population will become Muslim. Why? Because indigenous people don't have children anymore, and the Islamic community does. So the problem we're going to face is that, and then if you want to know what this looks like in practice, I was also spoken to in no uncertain terms by a Coptic taxi driver once when I was, actually on the time I was in Zaitun, and he said, you've got to be careful in Europe, he said. We Copts were the majority in Egypt once. We are the indigenous people here. We were the Coptic Christians. And the Arabs came and they outbred us, and now we're a small and rather severely oppressed minority. You want to be careful in Europe, in case things fall out as they have done in Egypt. And I thought he was exaggerating. Now, people reply when you have this kind of conversation, you can't believe in statistics, and all these predictions are based on nothing changing, and things always change, so stop being alarmist and stop being difficult. And that may be true. But nonetheless, as a Christian community in Europe, we face two enormously powerful ideologies, both of which are in fact Christian heresies. Islam is a form of developed Aryanism, and Marxism is a form of Judeo-Christian utopianism that does without religion. So the question is, what are we going to do? Well, at one level, we're going to be in serious trouble. It's very nice to know that in China, the church is, despite the difficulties that the Catholic Church is having in China, the number of Christians in China is statistically huge. They're having terrible trouble with an oppressive totalitarian regime, but it's huge. Since 1989 in Russia, when there were almost no Christians, it's now the fact that 75% of adult Russians identify as Russian Orthodox Christians. That's something of a miracle. Whether you think it's a real statistic or has real quality or real depth to it, or whether you think it's a cultural or political phenomenon, it's still inconceivable that since there were almost no Christians to speak of in 1989, the monasteries are now full and the seminaries are now full and 3/4 of the population identify as. So we don't give up hope as Christians, but what we recognize, I think, is that there's a real possibility that Europe may suffer the fate of North Africa. North Africa was, in the time of St. Augustine, a profoundly flourishing and wonderful culturally and theologically and sociologically Christian center. And when it became Muslim, it never became Christian again. So one of the things that we have to ask ourselves as Christians in Europe is, having been severely debilitated by the progressive left, silenced and thrown out or pushed to the margins of society, with a growing Islam 20 or so years down the road, what is the fate of the church going to be? And I think probably it's back to the catacombs. In Africa, the struggle between Islam and Christianity is very finely balanced. So we have something to be encouraged about in China, something to be inspired by in Russia, something to pray for in Africa. And we in Europe, we have to work out how we're going to bear witness and to keep the church authentic as culture and history takes us inexorably somewhere near the scenario I put before you. Some of you will have some exciting questions to ask me, and perhaps I'll stop now and I'll take questions. Thank you.